Now we get into more controversial territory, whole grains. These break down, in my view, to gluten-containing and gluten-free. And I think it's important to not just throw all of the grain baby out with the bathwater because some people are gluten sensitive. Remember that brown rice, oats, and quinoa are gluten-free. And then you have whole wheat, barley, and rye. Now, there's no studies, to my knowledge, that directly assess whole grain consumption being increased and decreasing leaky gut. But there is a 2020 systematic review that found, and I'll quote here, intake of whole grains increased bifidobacteria and lactobacillus levels and reduced pathogenic bacteria. So I think it's a mistake to say no one can ever have whole grains, especially because there are some people that don't do well on lots of fermented foods and lots of vegetables and do better on a moderate to higher protein and starch type of diet. And we just want to honor the different people and put people and their improvements first and not necessarily a dietary philosophy. To acknowledge gluten and the problematic aspect of gluten in part is a protein called gliadin. A 2020 clinical trial published in the journal Gut gave patients who suspected they had a problem with gluten a gluten-free diet for 6 months. They documented reductions in serum zonulin, gastrointestinal symptoms, and given this sort of systemic inflammatory connection, improvements in fatigue, anxiety, and joint pain. They also commented that serum zonulin helped to distinguish non-celiac, gluten-sensitive individuals from healthy controls, and that wheat withdrawal was associated with a reduction in zonulin levels. So this is one component. Now, as I've said many a time on the podcast in the past, the prevalence of non-celiac, meaning you're not diagnosable as celiac, gluten sensitivity, but you still notice or suspect you're having a reaction to gluten, is roughly 3, maybe 5% of the population. Some studies show less than that. Some studies show more than that. 3 to 5 is kind of where you average out. So it is something, and it is incorrect for, let's say, your gastroenterologist to say, oh, if you don't have celiac, don't worry about gluten, right? Because this has been documented in fairly rigorous trials. However, I think there's a very crucial component of this that's been left out. And this is wonderfully exemplified by this 2018 randomized control trial. And by the way, there are numerous studies that have found similar to what I'm about to share with you. They took about 60 people who reported they had reactivity to gluten. They were non-celiac gluten sensitive. They were given either a placebo bar or a bar containing gluten or a bar that was gluten-free but was high FODMAP, specifically high in fructans. And what they found is fascinating. The group that was given the gluten had less gastrointestinal symptoms, whereas the group that was given the high FODMAP or the high fructan bar had a clear exacerbation of symptoms. And this enters the other component of gluten-containing foods that's probably more problematic. And this is the FODMAPs. Remember that wheat, rye, and barley, common gluten-containing foods, are also high in FODMAP. So when people go gluten-free, they do two things simultaneously, even if they don't realize it. They go gluten-free, but they also reduce their FODMAP content. And as this study showed, it might actually be the FODMAP that's the trigger and not the gluten, because this study we just covered controlled for and reduced the gluten in one and gave gluten in the other bar, allowing you to see that it seems to be for more people that the FODMAPs are the problem. And here is a list of foods in terms of low FODMAP versus high FODMAP. So grains that are low FODMAP, what we want if you're sensitive: oats, quinoa, brown rice. Conversely, whole wheat bread, barley, and rye are high FODMAP. Then certain vegetables are high FODMAP and may be triggering. And this is really a very important example for people who feel as though they're eating fairly healthy, but are still struggling with symptoms. It might be your microbiome is imbalanced and you need, at least temporarily, to reduce the FODMAP content. And I'll share the evidence with you here in a moment, but it's pretty replete. And this has been shown to reduce inflammation, reduce leaky gut, reduce symptoms. So other potential triggers would be broccoli, cauliflower, asparagus, garlic, onions, avocados, whereas kale, spinach, carrots, cucumbers, green beans, and zucchini could be very tolerated. And this is a key insight because for some people, they can't piece this together. It's not very intuitive in terms of how we determine high FODMAP versus low FODMAP, which is why we're reliant upon food lists like this. And then other fruits that can be triggering that are high FODMAP, apples, grapes, plums, watermelons, and peaches, whereas helpful or lower FODMAP, blueberries, raspberries, cantaloupe, oranges, and strawberries. Now, coming back to the data, a 2021 clinical trial put people on a low FODMAP diet for 3 months, and they found a decrease in multiple measures of leaky gut, LPS, and serum zonulin. Quoting, GI symptoms, psychological state, and QOL, or quality of life, significantly improved in these patients. Simultaneously, an improvement in small intestinal permeability and intestinal mucosa integrity occurred. So zooming out for a moment, you may have heard people say, well, people who go gluten-free see reductions in zonulin, reductions of leaky gut. Well, it might be, as this study is substantiating, the reduction in FODMAP. Why this matters is because FODMAP tolerance is able to be recovered. 50% of the high FODMAP foods that are cut out of the diet can later be reintroduced and tolerance can be recovered, because it could be that the FODMAPs are the problem. And again, we know that a temporary lower FODMAP diet heals leaky gut, reduces inflammation, and also reduces things like dysbiosis and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and therefore leads to improved tolerance. So if you did want to, let's say, go out and have that glass of wine and also maybe have a slice of pizza or a bowl of pasta or whatever it is, the odds are fairly likely that you will be able to do so. And why I care about this is because I would like for you to have the broadest diet and the most food freedom and not be falsely attributing your improvements on a gluten-free diet to lifelong need to avoid gluten due to the gliadin, but rather it may have been the FODMAPs again, which is recoverable. So hopefully that all makes sense. And moving on to the next food here, dairy, controversial. Lactose malabsorption prevalence in the US is about 42%, and the cow's milk or the casein allergy is anywhere between 1 to 4%. Think about that for a moment. The lactose, the sugar, the carbohydrate, 42% intolerance. In actual protein allergy, 1 to 5%. Now, remember that the other carbohydrates, the FODMAPs, tolerance there is recoverable. Well, same thing here. Meta-analyses have demonstrated that interventions that help heal the gut, namely probiotics, improve lactose tolerance. Now, why is this? Well, when the food reactivity is carbohydrate malabsorption, again, that is recoverable because as the intestinal tract heals, endogenous or your internal production of enzymes also tends to be improved. And that allows absorption and digestion of the carbohydrates that weren't able to be digested prior. Again, why all this matters is if you've had an experience of improvement when cutting out gluten or dairy, it's more likely that it's the carbohydrate malabsorption component that when you reduce those carbohydrates, you saw improvements that led to your improvements. And that is able to be improved. And it's much more rare, although it can happen, but it's more rare that you have a true inflammatory reaction to one of the antigenic proteins in these foods. So zooming way out, the take home here is if you've gone gluten-free or you've gone dairy-free, don't be afraid to reintroduce these foods, because if the issue was carbohydrate malabsorption, that tends to improve over time, and therefore tolerance also tends to improve over time. And if you do perform a reintroduction and you do notice an aversion, then as we always say, listen to your body. But if you haven't run an experiment, it's something to bear in mind. Okay, so then a few foods that are controversial. Artificial sweeteners. If you had asked me on this 5+ years ago, I would have had a more conservative perspective on artificial sweeteners, sort of against them. Looking at this 2023 review paper, I'll quote, although some human trials have observed a dysbiotic effect of artificial sweeteners, many randomized control trials have reported a lack of significant effects on the gut microbiota. Now, the gut microbiota is not leaky gut, but they are interrelated. I'm not convinced in a big credit to Lane Norton, who I think has done some great reporting on artificial sweeteners as it pertains to metabolic health. But I'm not convinced that artificial sweeteners are going to be a problem for everyone. I had cited years ago the San Antonio longitudinal study on aging, and they did find a correlation between higher consumption of artificially sweetened drinks and waist circumference. But evidently, as more research has been done, they're not finding any metabolic ill effects, and we weren't able to find anything convincing showing exacerbations of gastrointestinal symptoms. And so ultimately, I would listen to your body, but I don't think from a data-driven perspective, we can say that artificial sweeteners are going to be a problem for most people and sort of fuel leaky gut. Nightshade vegetables. This is also something where there's not a lot of research, but this is something that I personally have noticed. If I consume too much either tomato or red peppers, I will experience joint pain, as will my mother. So this tends, at least in my observation, to follow family lines. So that's something to think about. If you've done everything else and you're noticing joint pain, take stock of the nightshades that you're consuming and see if you can draw a correlation, which should be repeatable, between consumption of nightshades and joint pain. Usually it starts about 24 hours later. Again, this is not going to be a majority thing, but it's a fine-tuning factor to pay attention to. Seed oils. One study did not find that soybean oil increased lipopolysaccharides. And I think you could make a case that continual heating and reheating of seed oils might pose a problem. But I'm not convinced that seed oils pose a problem for human health. I know this is a loaded topic, and we are reviewing the evidence here, and I plan on releasing a piece that really goes through this in a very thoughtful and evidence-based fashion. And certainly my persuasion is more leaning in the direction away from seed oils because they're not necessarily an ancestral norm, if you will. But when juxtaposing that across randomized control trials that are designed to clarify, is the seed oil the problem, or is it more of a bystander effect or guilt by association? At least thus far, I'm not convinced that seed oils pose a problem. I know that sounds like heresy, but more to follow. And then finally, there's a few plant irritants, oxalates, salicylates, and lectins. And I can't say that, well, firstly, there's not ample research to give us the luxury of having scientific evidence to learn from. So then it's more so anecdote and experience. And I can't say that any of these foods seem to be problematic for most people. Perhaps if someone is consuming a very high amount of oxalates, salicylates, or lectins, reducing that could be helpful. I think what happens more often than not, especially in the case of lectins, people make many changes that improve the quality of their diet, and they think it's because of the lectins, but sort of like the gluten-free example, people go gluten-free, but they actually end up going low FODMAP, and it might be the FODMAP reduction that was actually why they improved. I suspect with lectins, that's what's happening. And at some point, we'll do a full review on lectins also. And then oxalates and salicylates, my perspective here, and I don't think anyone has this fully figured out, but my thinking is that if someone is not consuming a very, very high amount of either one of these, then it's more likely you need to improve the health of their gut by going through all the other steps that we outlined. And the oxalate or salicylate sensitivities are usually secondary to a gut that's not very healthy or sort of running with that back injury.